We come now to Hebrews 11 and Hebrews 12, and this is our lecture on both of those chapters. One thing that I want to pay some attention to and bring to your mind as we begin this is oftentimes Hebrews chapter 11, which is probably the most memorable of the passages in Hebrews and one of the most well remembered, is oftentimes treated as a standalone chapter, the Hall of Faith, so to speak. And one of the things that I want to do on top of making observations through these two chapters is just to show how Hebrews 11 is a continuation of an argument that's already been made in chapter 10. And chapter 12 is absolutely a culmination of what the author is doing in chapter 11. So finding the author of Hebrews and his argument in here is going to be one of the things we want to do. And so I've included, obviously, here my own outline of this. And as we move into this idea of connecting chapter 11 and 12, the author has already made this point and is starting to build this idea about what faith is. And the audience, he reminds the audience that they've already borne up under this suffering, reproach, affliction, that they've accepted the seizure of their property and because they know they have a better possession. And the issue is that the better possession that the audience has is a promise. They don't already have it. It's an invisible something that is not yet possessed but is possessed. And so the author is going to encourage them, look, don't throw away your confidence. And this idea of throwing away confidence and shrinking back, there are going to be examples that he gives. Obviously, the Exodus generation is already an example of people who have thrown away their confidence. They've had this suffering in the midst of invisibility, invisible promises, but they've shrunk back, they've thrown away their confidence. And so the idea is what the audience needs is they need endurance. And it is this faith that produces endurance that the audience, that the author of Hebrews is going to play off of in terms of talking about the nature of faith. Now, a couple of things that hold this chapter together that you might notice in your commentary reading and that I want to pay some attention to is this whole section is going to begin with the idea of the blood of Abel's blood by sacrifice. And that is by faith Abel offered the sacrifice. And then when the audience arrives at the city of God, it will be one of the things that they will arrive at is to the blood of Jesus, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. And this idea of Abel's blood, probably the blood of sacrifice, is connects these two chapters together, bookending them in 11:4 and 12:24. A couple of other things rhetorically about this chapter that make some that are probably fairly obvious, but just want to pay some attention to them. The author is using two rhetorical devices particularly. One is the idea of a rapid listing of examples, kind of rapid fire, like by faith. By faith Abel, by faith Enoch, by faith Noah, by faith Abraham, and continuing on and showing this kind of breadth of material and breadth of examples, but also this repetition of by faith, by faith, by faith, that this is a very good rhetorical device, particularly if this is a sermon. And then finally, one of the things that connects chapters 11 and 12 is this idea of the city of God, that Abraham goes out not knowing, looking for a city whose founder and builder is God, and that God has prepared a city for those who have this faith. And then ultimately, the audience is not going to arrive at Mount Zion, but it is going to arrive at the heavenly, not at the earthly Mount Sinai, but at the heavenly Mount Zion, the city of God. And so these are some of the ideas that tie this chapter together. All right. We've already talked about here about the idea of, in chapter 11, beginning with by faith Abel. Abel offers a sacrifice better than Cain's. Cain is not really developed as an example of no faith, but is very well known in Second Temple Jewish literature as one who, though he was a son, who was a son of favor, repudiated his inheritance and was disowned and disinherited. And Abel is known as the righteous one. Enoch is also an example here. So by faith Abel, by faith Enoch. And of course Enoch he was attested that he had pleased God. And here's our one famous verse: "The faith, but without faith, it is impossible to please God." But that he rewards, and that's going to be the issue with faith. Is that faith? There's invisible. In the midst of suffering and issues that cause for endurance, there is a great reward coming, and that is the nature of faith. And that's what the audience has to embrace. That's what these examples from of old have to embrace as well. By faith, Noah warned, but he was an heir of the righteousness that was to come. Abraham becomes an example that the author has already developed at the end of chapter 6, but now continues. This Abraham obeys. He sets out and again introducing this idea that he was looking for this place. He could never find it. It wasn't here, but he was looking forward to the city that was built by God. And that by having faith, he received a certain degree of triumphal power. He was able to bear children of promise, and that God honored that. God gave something of that reward to him, but it was not clearly seen by him. And here is a great explanation in 11:13 to 16. All of these, they died in faith, but with this idea of invisibility. They were not able to see or receive the promises. They saw them from a distance, and they greeted them, and they confessed that they were bound to suffer on this earth. They were strangers and refugees on this earth, which is such a rich idea about what we as believers are. But anyone who talks like this, look at this, anyone who talks like this makes it clear that they're seeking a homeland. They're a refugee, and they have not come from a land that's their home, and they have not found a land that is their home. But by faith, they are searching for this city of God. And it's a beautiful idea. They're looking for this better country, this heavenly one. And this is that God is not ashamed to be called their God, and has prepared a city for them. That those who walk in faith, that is what God is looking for in this idea of enduring in the midst of suffering by means of faith in the face of invisible promises. He picks it back up again with Abraham. Abraham is put to the test. He offers up Isaac, this ultimate example of faith and this ultimate foreshadowing of the work of Jesus and what Jesus is going to do. This idea that he will receive him from the dead, that Abraham anticipated the resurrection, and ultimately Jesus will be the ultimate fulfillment of that. Isaac invokes blessings, and I want to pay some attention to this. It might get lost a little bit, but it's interesting here that by faith Isaac invokes blessing for the future on Jacob and Esau. That Isaac is going to invoke blessings for both of them, but it will only be Jacob who receives them in faith. Esau will repudiate them. And this is going to be something that he's going to make clear later on. And I think that Esau is a very interesting example that really parallels the Exodus generation, who is given promises, given blessings, but repudiates those promises and blessings. Eventually has second thoughts about that, but is unable to procure those blessings. The Exodus generation and Esau have that same profile in that. Jacob and Joseph both make these end of life testamentary promises and handing on of inheritance. Moses was hidden from his parents. Moses refused to be called. He chose to endure ill treatment with the people of God, which is a mark of faith, that I will take on suffering, I will endure suffering, knowing that there is a promise to come. And this idea of the Messiah, he was looking ahead to the reward, and so he was able to endure this ill treatment. A couple things as we move on, and he continues to this by faith. One thing that is a little bit might escape our notice, but I don't think would escape the notice of the first readers is you go through this progression of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph to Moses, and then Moses to Jericho. But it's interesting here, by faith the people passed through the Red Sea. That's Exodus. as if they were on dry land, the Egyptians attempted to do when they were drowned, but they were drowned. And then by faith, the walls of Jericho fell. So Exodus here, the book of Joshua here. What is conspicuously absent in this is the book of Numbers. And it's not that there are not faithful things that happen. I mean, they strike the rock, water comes out. There are examples of faith in that as we think about the history. But the author has already made a very interesting point back in chapter 3 and 4 that this generation, this whole generation, has no faith. And so, what I might call the missing verse in Hebrews chapter 11, you go from Exodus to Joshua, no book of Numbers is mentioned here, no faith there. Because he's already dealt with them in chapters 3 and 4 that they have no faith. In chapter 30 or verse 31, by faith Rahab the prostitute, and of course Carl Mosier's article is he thinks that Rahab is the culmination of this. I'm not exactly sure what if I agree with him on this, but Rahab is an interesting idea in the sense that not your typical example of the quintessential example of faith, but as Kester notes in his commentary, that Rahab and those who come, like Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, are all these kind of imperfect examples of faith, that they are failures, but they are also faithful at certain points. They are put forth here in this next section. You have examples, really examples of triumph, and that would be all of these folks who all these examples of they are obtaining promises, they're shutting the mouths of lions, they're quenching fires, they're escaping the edge of the sword, they're winning, they're mighty in war, they're putting foreign armies to flight. But there are also and these are examples of faith, but there's also examples of faith that are suffering examples of faith, not triumphant examples of faith, but suffering examples of faith. These who are tortured, they are suffering. They're suffering mocking and flogging and chains, and are stoned to death, or sawn in two, or killed with the sword. And so you have faith that, yes, you have examples of triumph, but you also have examples of suffering. And this is going to be important because Jesus is an example of both. He is an example of faith in the midst of suffering, but also faith that ultimately moves to triumph. And that's what the author wants the people that are reading this to embrace, that they might be undergoing suffering now, and they are examples of faith in suffering, but there is ultimately a great reward in which they will be then examples of faith in triumph eventually. So he goes on to say, these were all commended, they were all borne witness of. This martureo is this verb. They were all commended for their faith, but they did not receive what was promised. But God has something better that he's going to inaugurate with us, with the audience, so to speak here, that they would be made perfect. And then we have really this is the culmination of the chapter of faith, which is not even in chapter 11, it's chapter 12. And we have this idea that there's all these people who have been borne witness of. And since we have been surrounded by all these witnesses, all these people who have borne witness of, let's lay aside the weight of sin, the suffering that is so difficult, and let's run with endurance, perseverance, the race that is set before us. And again, looking to Jesus. And who is Jesus? Looking to Jesus. Who is Jesus? He's the author or the pioneer and perfecter of faith. You have all of these examples of faith in the past, but Jesus he's the writer, the inaugurator, and perfecter of faith. And look at what he does. He is an example of faith in suffering. He endures this cross. He's an example of faith in the midst of shame. But what has happened? God has exalted him. He is an example of faith in the midst of triumph. And now he has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. This is how Jesus is the ultimate example of faith in the midst of suffering and faith in the midst of triumph. And so the author is then going to say, look, everyone, you got to consider all these examples as you bear hostility in the face of sinners, that you might not grow weary and lose heart. Because there were others who grew weary and lost heart, like the Exodus generation. Esau will grow weary and lose heart, but not you guys, because you need to understand that you are indeed legitimate children, appointed for inheritance. And God treats you as children because you know that he has done that because of the idea of discipline, or the Greek idea of paideia, that discipline is a mark of true children. And all these children, all if you don't have paideia, then you're an illegitimate child. But if you do have paideia, you do have discipline, and if you undergo that discipline, that training by God, then that is the proof that you are indeed true children. And he says again, here's our faith. Discipline always seems painful. It seems suffering-esque, not triumphant at the time, but later it will yield its triumphant fruit. And so he then makes this exhortation, look, you're undergoing discipline, therefore encourage, lift up, strengthen, make these feet straight. Don't heal these people that are drooping and struggling through this. And he goes on to say, look, we don't want anyone like Esau, who sold away his inheritance. He sold it away. He gave it away for a single meal because he did not have the faith in the face of invisibility. He was not looking forward to what was to come. And later, when he had second thoughts about this, he was rejected and he was not able to repent, even though he sought the blessing with tears. And so, just like the Exodus generation, who repudiate their inheritance, want to go back to Egypt, then when God says, no, you guys have to wander, they say, oh, we're so sorry, we want to now go in. They try to go in, they're not able to go in. They have to wander for 40 years. The author's saying, look, don't be like this. Have faith in the face of the invisible promises here. Because eventually, you're not coming to this Mount Sinai. You're coming, which is woeful and darkness and gloom and tempest and whirlwind, but you've come to the city of God, Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. All these messengers in having a feast together, and you've come to an assembly, and the word here, firstborn, is these favored heirs. You've come to an assembly of heirs, and here is Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood that is better than the blood of Abel. And again, thinking back to the beginning of chapter 11. And he then goes on to one of the warnings. If they didn't escape, probably the Exodus generation is who he's talking about. If they didn't escape when there was a warning on earth, how will we escape if the greatest messenger from God has come? How will we escape if we neglect this salvation? So those are some thoughts on Hebrews 11 and 12. Hope that's helpful. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about this in the forums.